The day the lawyer read the will, everyone in the room laughed. Not polite laughter, not the embarrassed kind people muffle behind their hands. This was the full, ugly sound of people who had been waiting a long time to see someone fall and had finally gotten their wish. Four older girls crowded the doorway of Mrs. Dorothea Marsh's office parlor at the Greenbrier County Relief Home, and one of them slapped the door frame so hard the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The two trustees seated along the wall exchanged that tight smile adults wear when they want to look sympathetic, but are really just cruelty dressed in better clothes. Even the lawyer from Alderton dropped his eyes to his papers, as if embarrassed to be the one speaking the words aloud. Mrs. Dorothea Marsh stood nearest the stove. Warmth in the relief home belonged to rank, and she had held the highest rank in this building for 19 years. Her steel gray hair was pulled so tight it seemed to drag all the mercy off her face, leaving behind something angular, something that had long since decided softness was a liability. When the laughter finally subsided enough for her to speak, she folded the letter with the deliberate care of someone who had already decided what it meant, looked across the room directly at the girl standing alone near the window, and her voice came out flat as pressed tin. "Well, Miss Calloway, your grandfather has left you a box of wind and a house built against a grave." Wren Calloway was 16 years old. She stood very still when Mrs. Marsh said it the way she had learned to stand still through many things, and she did not look away. She had been at the Greenbrier County Relief Home since she was 11, arriving the February after her mother Ruth died of pneumonia in a boarding room in Gat Mills, West Virginia, with nothing left to her name except the daughter she had spent 5 years raising, mostly alone. Before the relief home, Wren had moved through 3 households like a piece of furniture nobody quite wanted, but nobody could bring themselves to throw into the street. 3 months with her mother's brother Vernon, who drank steadily from noon onward, and who sold her mother's wedding quilt for whiskey money the same week Wren arrived. 7 months with the Whitlock family outside Lewisburg, who needed extra hands for their dairy operation, and who seemed to believe that children who worked from before sunrise until after dark had no legitimate use for lantern light. After supper, they found her reading. One night, a pamphlet about crop rotation she had taken from the donation bin, and they looked at her as if she had been caught doing something obscene. 4 months with the Dunmore family, who returned her to the relief home after she pointed out with the particular directness that had already gotten her into trouble twice that the leak in their parlor ceiling needed patching before the Lord would be inclined to hear anyone's prayers through it. Mrs. Marsh had accepted her back each time with the expression of a woman collecting a debt she had never wanted to be owed. 5 years at the relief home had taught Wren several things. She had learned that the dormitory was coldest in the corner nearest the north window, that the third step on the back staircase creaked in the middle, but held silent on the left edge, that Mrs. Marsh counted the books in the donation bin every Tuesday morning, and that the safest place to read after lights out was crouched behind the linen cabinet on the second landing with a tallow stub short enough that its light would not show under the door. She had also learned that there was no point expecting anyone in this building to be surprised by her, because they had decided what she was long before she had any say in the matter. The will said she had inherited 12 acres of rocky slope in a hollow 3 miles past the town of Cinder Hollow, pressed against a limestone bluff. The will said there was a cabin on the property. The will said there was a cave at the base of the bluff, a hole in the cliff face that local children had apparently been calling the White Lung for years because it breathed fog outward in summer and seemed to exhale in winter like something alive. The will said all of this had belonged to Ezra Calloway, her mother's father, a man Wren had never met, who had died the previous spring at age 78 in that cabin alone, with nobody to send word to anyone. The auctioneer had laughed when Ezra Calloway bought that tract in 1867 for $9. He had apparently said in front of a room full of people that the man had purchased exactly $9 worth of nothing. Nearly 20 years later, the lawyer from Alderton was reading the transfer of that same nothing to a girl who owned 1 spoon, 2 dresses, a tin of needles, and 3 books with their covers torn off, who stood in a room full of people laughing at her inheritance, the same way a room full of people had laughed at the man who left it to her. Something happened inside Wren when the lawyer said the word cave. She could not have named it precisely. It was not hope. She had trained herself out of hope the way you train yourself out of flinching through enough repetition that the instinct simply stopped arriving. It was something older than hope, something that felt like recognition, though she had never seen Blackthorn Gap and could not have explained what she was recognizing. When the lawyer said the words, "breathes in weather," something fired in her chest like a coal catching in a draft, sudden and warm and surprising. She wanted to see a place that kept its own weather. She wanted to understand why a man would spend his entire life measuring the breadth of a mountain. The trustees were already standing. The girls in the doorway had moved on to whispering to each other, delighted in the particular way that people are delighted when someone else's misfortune confirms something they already believed. Mrs. Marsh watched Wren with that thin satisfaction she wore when the world confirmed her lowest expectations. Wren did not tell any of them what she was thinking. She left 4 days later. Mrs. Marsh did not try to stop her. Wren packed everything she owned into a single carpet bag, the spoon, the dresses, the needles, the 3 coverless books, and a small cloth sack of cornmeal she took from the pantry without asking, because Mrs. Marsh had never given her anything she did not take for herself. The morning she left, Mrs. Marsh stood in the doorway of her office and watched with an expression that could have been satisfaction or relief. The two looked identical on her face. "Right when you change your mind," she said, as if changing her mind were already settled, as if the only question were when. Wren walked down the front path without answering. The wagon driver who took her as far south as the fork below Alderton was a man of few words, most of them unflattering. He set her down at the crossroads with the same efficiency he used to unload fence posts pointed down a rutted track that disappeared into laurel shadow, and said that Cinder Hollow was 3 miles that way, and the road got worse before it ended. He did not wait for her response. He clicked his tongue at the mules and left her standing in the November mud with her carpet bag and the road going quiet behind her. The road did get worse. Within a quarter mile, it narrowed from wagon ruts to a single rocky track, the kind made by feet rather than wheels by people and animals who had never expected anything wider than themselves. Tulip poplars and white oaks gave way to hemlock and rhododendron, the low, heavy growth that means poor soil and steep grade, and hollows that hold their shadow well into the morning. Somewhere below her, she could hear water moving through limestone, a sound like cold thinking, but she could not see it. The hollow swallowed sound the way a closed fist swallows light. She walked for 2 hours, the carpet bag handle dug into her right palm until she switched hands, then dug into that palm too. She switched back. The sky above the tree line had gone the color of old pewter by the time she came around the last bend in the track and stopped. The bluff rose out of the hollow like something that had been placed there. 60 feet of pale limestone stained with rust where iron had leached through for generations, topped with a fringe of scrub pine and mountain laurel. In the narrow throat of the hollow, it did not look like geology. It looked like a decision, like something had looked at this particular hollow and chosen it. The cabin crouched at the base of the bluff, the way exhausted things crouch, not resting, but collapsed into the shape of rest. The porch had pulled away from the front wall at an angle that was physically wrong, visibly wrong, the kind of structural failure that made the eyes try to correct it. One shutter hung from a single strap hinge. The roof showed gaps where shingles had blown off and nobody had replaced them. Those gaps were not small. The chimney leaned toward the southeast as though something had shoved it, and it had been falling in slow motion for years. Wren stood in what had been a yard, was still technically a yard, if you counted thistles and shale flakes, and the collapsed remains of a woodpile that had gone silver with age, and begun to sink into the ground, and looked at all of it. The looking took something out of her that she had not expected to give. She had prepared herself for bad. She had not prepared herself for the specific quality of this bad, which was the bad of something that had been fighting for a long time by itself and was losing. The smell of the place reached her mineral cold old ash, and underneath those something else. Clean, almost sharp, something that came from the direction of the bluff. She pushed open the cabin door. The hinges announced her arrival to the entire hollow. One room 15 feet by 12, with the particular feeling of spaces where a person has lived a long time and then stopped. An iron bedstead with a straw tick mattress that mice had been borrowing from for years. A table with one leg shorter than the others, shimmied with a folded scrap of leather. A cast iron stove with a hairline crack running across one plate. She could see daylight through it from the wrong angle. A single wooden chair. A tin cup on a shelf above the stove, placed with the handle facing outward, the way a person places a cup they intend to use again soon. On the bed, a wool blanket folded with absurd precision corners, squared edges, even the kind of neatness that is almost aggressive in the face of everything else in the room. Ezra Calloway had died tidy. That made it more sorrowful than a mess would have. Wren set her carpetbag on the table and stood in the last of the gray afternoon light, listening to the cabin speak in the language of old wood under wind pressure. Through the gaps between wallboards, and there were more gaps than she had hoped, she could see the bluff. At its base, half-screened by wind-thrown laurel branches and a scatter of fallen limestone, she could make out a darker shadow. A difference in the rock. An opening. She had walked 3 miles down a road that ended at nothing to inherit a cabin that was falling down 12 acres that could not be plowed or timbered or turned to any use a practical person would recognize, and a hole in a cliff that apparently breathed. She had $1.32. She had no family anywhere in the state of West Virginia who would answer a letter she wrote. She had 3 coverless books and a tin of needles and a cloth sack of cornmeal that had seemed more substantial when she packed it. She sat on the edge of the bed. The rope springs creaked under her weight in a way that sounded like an opinion. She did not cry. She had stopped crying the year her mother died, not because grief had left her, but because crying requires the belief that someone might hear you. And she had lost that belief, so gradually she had not noticed it leaving until it was already gone. She did not sleep well that first night. She lay on the mouse-softened mattress and listened to the wind find every gap in the walls, and listened to the bluff outside settling into its nighttime stillness. And she thought about Mrs. Marsh's face. A box of wind and a house built against a grave. The certainty in that voice. The pleasure of it. She lay awake wondering if Mrs. Marsh was right. The next morning she tried to make the place livable in the way you try to do things when there is no alternative to trying. She stuffed rags she found in a trunk under the bed into the worst gaps between the wallboards. She swept out years of mouse evidence with a bundle of hemlock branches. She found a tin bucket with only one hole low on the side and carried it a quarter-mile to a spring that ran thin and iron cold from between 2 limestone slabs. The water tasted of minerals in deep places, but it was clear. The stove worked if she kept the fire small and the damper adjusted carefully, which took her most of the morning to work out. The cornmeal she had brought from the relief home stretched into mush that she ate standing at the table with her 1 spoon. It was not enough. She knew it would not be enough for long. She was finishing the last of it, thinking about how much she disliked cold mush, and whether the season was too late for chickweed to be growing in the hollow, when she stepped from the stove to the bed to get her coat, and the floor spoke differently under her left foot. Not the creak of stressed wood or the soft give of rot. A hollow sound. Deliberate. She looked down at the board under her foot. She knelt, ran her fingers along the edge. The board was loose, not because time had worked it free, but because someone had deliberately freed it and set it back without nailing it. The difference was small but unmistakable to someone who had spent years learning to notice small things. The board rested in its groove rather than being held by it. Wren worked her fingers under the edge and lifted. Below it, a cavity in the floor joist sides and floor lined with oilcloth carefully cut and fitted. Inside the oilcloth, a package. The wrapping was deliberate, layer after layer, tied with cord that had been knotted in the careful way of someone accustomed to wanting things to last. Wren lifted it out. Her hands were not quite steady. Not fear, something about the care of it. The intention. Whoever had put this here had put it here for a reason, and then died before the reason could be delivered, and these 2 facts sat on her chest simultaneously. She unwrapped the oilcloth on the table by the window where the light was best. 14 ledger books, each approximately the size of a hymnal, each numbered on the spine in faded lamp-black ink 1 through 14. Some had swelled with damp at their edges, rippled and warped, but the ink inside was intact. Others were still tight and dry, protected by the layers of oilcloth around them. Beneath the books, 2 thermometers in padded wooden cases, a brass compass with a cracked crystal face, and a tin of carpenter's pencils sharpened to fine points that had not been used in some time. She picked up the first ledger, opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and cramped, made by someone who had grown up when paper was expensive, and the habit of economy in all things had never quite left him. But it was legible. She read it in the thin November light. October 12, 1867. Arrived at Blackthorn Gap. Purchased the tract at auction for $9. The auctioneer laughed when I paid. He said I had bought exactly $9 worth of nothing. I do not think he is wrong, but there is a cave here, and I have questions about caves. Wren sat down on the floor with the book in her hands and read until the light failed completely. Ezra Calloway had been a schoolteacher in the valley south of Lewisburg before the war. He had come back from the war with something altered in him that he never named directly in the journals, but that showed up obliquely in the way he wrote about people at a distance, with the wariness of someone who had been in close proximity to what people were capable of and had decided he preferred geology. He had read an article about limestone cave systems in the Allegheny Highlands. In the journals, he mentioned it only as the article, as if it were a document of some significance, a thing that had changed the angle of his thinking, and he had gone looking for exactly this kind of place, a hollow with a limestone bluff and a cave large enough to have its own climate. He had bought the tract for $9 because nobody else wanted it. He had spent the next 18 years from 1867 until his death in the spring of 1885 measuring it. Every morning at sunrise and every evening at dusk, temperature at the cave mouth, temperature 50 feet in temperature, 100 feet in temperature outside in the yard. Wind direction. Humidity estimated by feel and by the behavior of a strip of wool he kept nailed to a post near the cave mouth. Loose meant dry, tight, and slightly curled meant moisture in the air. The phase of the moon, which he tracked not from superstition, but because he had read that atmospheric pressure fluctuated with lunar cycles, and he wanted to know if the cave's breathing pattern corresponded. He burned smoke pots at the cave entrance in different seasons and watched where the smoke went. In summer, the smoke drifted outward from the cave mouth during the heat of the day, cool air flowing out because the deep rock held cooler than the sun-heated air outside. At night in summer, the smoke sometimes reversed, drifting inward as the outside air cooled toward the cave's temperature. In winter, the smoke always drifted outward at night, warmer air flowing out of the cave because the deep rock held warmer than the frozen air outside. In deep winter, on the coldest nights, the smoke moved with purpose. It did not drift. It streamed. The cave breathed. The children of Cinder Hollow were right about that. The white lung breathed. But it did not breathe because it was alive. It breathed because of physics that Ezra Calloway had spent years working out through observation alone, without a university education in the relevant sciences, without access to the terminology that would later attach itself to what he had discovered. He wrote about the mountain's steadiness. He wrote about the stone's memory of other seasons. He was describing in the language available to a self-educated man in a West Virginia hollow in the 1870s what would eventually be called thermal mass, the capacity of dense rock to absorb heat, slowly store it, and release it slowly. The way a stone placed in a fire in the morning will still warm your hand at midnight. At sufficient depth below the surface, the limestone held a temperature close to the yearly average. Summer could not heat it much. The rock was too massive, too slow to respond to surface warmth. Winter could not cool it much either for the same reasons. It simply remained year after year at 52, 53, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Patient in a way that nothing else Wren had ever encountered was patient. And Ezra had written in the fifth ledger in the careful small hand of a man who was accustomed to having his ideas dismissed. What if you could borrow that steadiness? Wren read that sentence 3 times. The 6th through 9th ledgers were maps and measurements. Cross-sections of the cave drawn with meticulous care, arrows indicating the direction of airflow at different depths and different times of year. Temperature readings cataloged by month and by position within the cave. Diagrams of the crack systems in the bluff face where the cave connected to the outside air at points that were not the main entrance. Secondary vents that explained certain peculiarities in the cave's breathing pattern that had puzzled him for the first several years of observation. The 10th through 12th ledgers were engineering plans. Ezra had designed something he called a winter throat, an enclosed passage from the cabin to the cave mouth, a corridor of boards and mortar sealed at both ends by fitted doors with what he called a baffle vent. In the middle, an adjustable panel that would control how much cave air mixed with cabin air at any given time. The principle was not complicated, but it was strange. Instead of fighting the cold with fire, alone burning through wood, at a rate that left a solitary man constantly vulnerable to running short, he would connect the cabin's air supply to the cave's air supply. Let the mountain's steadiness buffer the cabin against the killing temperatures of February. Let 53 degrees of cave air mix with the cabin's air and prevent it from plunging to the temperatures that froze water in a tin cup by morning. He had started building it. The 12th ledger contained sketches of stone footings already laid at the cave mouth. She had walked past them in the yard without knowing what they were. 2 courses of flat limestone laid with care, half buried under years of leaf fall and blown soil. The ledger noted measurements for the lumber he would need. It noted that 14 boards from the porch were exactly the right length for the corridor walls. It noted that the lintel stone over the cave mouth entrance had been set in place in 1882 with the help of a neighbor named Clem Osgood, a stonemason who lived down the hollow, and that the lintel was ready for a door frame to be built beneath it. He had been dismantling the porch to build the corridor. Then he had died. The 13th ledger was a winter log from 1884, the last full winter he had survived. The 14th was different from all the others. Looser, more personal. Letters he had written and never sent to his daughter Ruth, who had left the hollow at 18 to marry a timberman from Gat Mills, who had died of pneumonia 6 years later, 2 years before Ezra himself, in one page near the back that was not a letter to Ruth. Wren found it on the third night, reading by the light of a tallow stub that was burning faster than she would have liked, and the title at the top of the page stopped her completely. To the child who still asks why. She sat very still for a long moment before she continued reading. I do not know if you will ever come here. I do not know if Ruth ever told you about me, or if you carry some picture of this place in your mind, or if you are reading this in complete surprise. I do not know if you will ever read this at all, but I want you to understand something, and I want to say it plainly in case you are the kind of person who needs to hear things said plainly. I was not crazy. Everyone in Cinder Hollow thought I was crazy, and some of them were kind about it, and some were not, but all of them were wrong. I was just patient. The mountain keeps its own time. If you can learn how to ask it, it will answer. What the mountain keeps steady will keep you alive if you learn how to ask it. Wren sat on the floor of the cabin in the dark after the tallow stub burned out in the cold that was already reaching for her through the gap between the stove and the wall. She had not finished sealing, and she held the 14th ledger against her chest. Someone like her had come before. Someone who noticed systems and trusted numbers more than other people's certainty, who had looked at something that everyone else had looked at and seen a different question. Someone who had been called crazy for 30 years and had kept working anyway. Someone who had left all of it, 30 years of work. 14 ledgers, the thermometers, the plans, the dream of a winter throat. He never got to finish in a box under the floor of a cabin at the end of a road that went nowhere, addressed to a granddaughter he had never met, in case she ever came. She was the kind of person who still asked why. He had known that about her without ever having seen her face. For the first time since her mother died, Wren cried. Not from sadness, from the shock of being recognized. The next morning, she made the walk into Cinder Hollow. 3 miles on a track that was marginally better in daylight, bordered by limestone outcroppings that pushed up through the soil at irregular intervals, and by the kind of woods that close in around you without being hostile, just indifferent to your comfort. The town revealed itself gradually: a white-painted church, a blacksmith shop with its forge already burning at this hour, a small wool warehouse with bales stacked visible through the open doors, and the mercantile. Ida Fenn ran the mercantile with her husband Clyde, but Clyde was apparently somewhere that was not the store, because it was Ida who stood behind the counter when Wren pushed through the door. A woman who appeared to have been assembled from straight lines, jaw-brow, the set of her shoulders, the edge of her voice when she spoke. You're the Calloway girl. Not a question. News traveled efficiently in small places. Wren confirmed it. Ida Fenn looked at her the way you look at a stray cat that has wandered into your barn, not with active cruelty exactly, but with the settled certainty that nothing good was going to come of this situation. Folks say that cave breathes. Ida picked up a rag and wiped a counter that appeared already clean. Cold in summer, warm in winter. Your grandfather spent 30 years measuring that breath, 30 years carrying smoke pots into that hole. 30 years of accurate data, Wren said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That's not nothing. Ida looked at her differently for a moment. Then she opened a ledger of her own. Cornmeal and salt. Credit. Due in spring. She wrote Wren's name with the neatness of someone who had been keeping accounts long enough to be unsentimental about them. The walk back was longer with the weight of the supplies, but shorter in her head because she was thinking about the 14th ledger, about what the mountain keeps steady, about 14 boards on the porch that were exactly the right length. The first 2 weeks in the cabin nearly killed her. She did not say this for effect, not even to herself. She said it because it was accurate, the way precise language is a form of respect for difficult things. The cornmeal ran out faster than she had calculated because cold labor burns more fuel than she had budgeted for, and hunger made the work harder and harder work, deepened the hunger in a loop she could not fully break. The spring ran thin in the cold, and she had to walk farther each day to find water that was not sheeted with ice. The cracked stoveplate leaked smoke in thin, steady streams that burned her eyes raw and coated the back of her throat with something she could not cough out. She woke at night shivering hard enough to hear her own teeth. She ate chickweed she found growing in the sheltered corner between the cabin's south wall and the bluff. She boiled acorns 3 times in the spring water to leach out the bitterness, ground them between 2 stones into something that was approximately flour, baked it on the stovetop into something that was approximately bread. She caught a rabbit in a snare she had made from a bootlace, which felt for 2 days like a significant victory. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. One morning, the 17th morning, she walked halfway to the road. She stopped at a place where the track bent around a stand of hemlock, and the tree line opened enough to show the ridge above, and she stood in the frozen mud and looked at the direction of Alderton. She was aware with a clarity that was almost physical of what lay in that direction, a dormitory with 40 beds of stove, that functioned meals that were predictable if not generous, and Mrs. Marsh's face, which would wear the satisfaction of someone who had been right all along. That face would be there every day. That satisfaction would be a fixture of every meal, every morning, every interaction for however long remained of her time at the relief home. She stood at the bend for a long time. Then she turned around. She could not have explained it precisely, not then. It was not entirely pride, though. Pride was in there. It was something closer to incompleteness. She had not yet read to the end of what Ezra had begun, and she was constitutionally incapable of putting down a book before she had reached the last page. She had not yet proven whether the 14th ledger's promise held any truth. She had not yet asked the mountain anything, and it had not yet had the chance to answer. She went back to the cabin. She ate the last of the acorn bread. She picked up the 12th ledger, the one with the construction plans, and read it again at the table by the window, with the light coming in at the angle it came in at this time of day, low and thin and doing its best. Then she looked at the porch that was already pulling away from the cabin at an angle that hurt to look at. The porch that was made of 14 boards of exactly the right length. She found the hammer in the single cupboard above the wash basin. She carried it outside. She stood on the sagging porch boards and looked down at them for what felt like a full minute. Then she started pulling them up. The nails had been in the wood long enough to form a kind of marriage with it. They did not want to be separated. Many bent before they came free. Many broke entirely. She saved every one she could straighten against her knee, dropping the salvageable ones into her coat pocket, where they clinked together with a sound that felt in the silence of the hollow like small encouragements. The boards themselves were heavy with years of weather, heavier than she had prepared her arms for, and the first 2 she tried to carry to the cave mouth she had to drag instead, which left trails in the frozen dirt like long signatures. She stacked them against the cabin wall by length the way the 12th ledger specified. Then she walked to the cave mouth and looked at it properly for the first time. The entrance was roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, narrowing as it went back into the dark. The limestone framing it had been shaped she could see now, dressed at the edges, squared slightly, made ready for a door. The lintel stone Ezra had mentioned sat across the top flat, and deliberate a foundation for a frame that had never been built beneath it. At the base of the entrance, half buried under seasons of fallen leaves and wind-carried soil, she could see the stone footings. 2 courses of flat limestone carefully laid, forming the base for walls that existed only in the 12th ledger. She cleared the footings with her hands, measured the distance from the cave mouth to where the cabin's front door would be if she removed the rest of the porch entirely. 22 feet. Ezra had estimated 20. She looked at the boards again. She counted the useful ones, 14 long boards, 8 shorter pieces. It was not enough lumber. She knew that. She did not have the skill to build what the ledger described, and she knew that too. She had read about how to set posts and frame walls and mix mortar the way you can read about swimming without being able to keep yourself above water. She picked up the first board anyway. She was bracing it against the stone footings, trying to figure out how it was supposed to stand upright without falling over. She had tried twice, and it had fallen both times, which was when she sat down in the leaf litter and stared at it. "You're doing it wrong." The voice came from behind her. The sound of it hit her like stepping on a stair that is not there. Her heart knocked hard against her ribs as she scrambled to her feet. He stood at the edge of the clearing. An old man 70 at least, perhaps more time, had a way of compressing past a certain point, making 65 and 75 look like neighbors. One eye was clouded, the iris gone milky with cataract. The other was sharp and dark and entirely present. His hands were stained in the deep creases with something white and powdery. He saw her look at them. "Lime," he said. "I was a stonemason once." He did not step closer immediately. He took in the situation with the unhurried thoroughness of someone accustomed to assessing structural problems. "Clem Osgood. I live down the hollow about a mile." He moved toward the footings with the gait of a man whose body kept a running count of its complaints, but had learned not to present them as emergencies. "I've been watching your smoke." He stopped at the edge of the footings and looked down at them. His expression shifted into something that was not quite recognition and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. "Ezra's footings. He laid them in '82. He pointed at the lintel stone with one lime-stained hand. "I helped him with that. We set it together, him and me." Wren found that she had nothing to say. The words had gone somewhere, she could not reach them. "He talked about you." Clem looked at her with his one clear eye, not studying her exactly, more like confirming something he had already worked out. The granddaughter he'd never met, Ruth's girl. Her throat tightened in a way she had not prepared for. "He sent a letter," she managed finally, "to the relief home, after my mother died, asking them to send me here." "I know. He told me he'd sent it." Something moved across Clem Osgood's face. "I assumed they'd told you." "The letter got there." The words came out flat because the only way to say them without breaking something was to say them flat. "It just didn't get to me." The silence that followed had weight. Clem looked at the half-stacked boards at the footings at the cave mouth, with its lintel waiting for a door that had never been hung. "You're trying to build his winter throat." "I'm trying not to die here." The honesty of it surprised her, the way the truest things sometimes slip out before you have had time to decide whether to say them. "I don't know if those are the same thing yet." He nodded slowly. Something in his posture shifted, not toward her exactly, but toward the project. "Your grandfather could read anything and understand it," he said. "Any principle, any diagram, any theory someone had written down. But his hands couldn't do what his head knew. That was his trouble with this." He picked up one of the boards and held it upright against the stone footing with a casual competence that made the gesture look effortless. "I can build anything, but I never understood what he was trying to do here, not really. The why of it escaped me." He looked at her sideways with the eye that still worked. "Between the two of us, we had one complete person. We just never figured out how to share correctly." He set the board down and reached into the leather satchel he had brought with him. She had not noticed it until now, the strap across his shoulder, and produced a square, A-level, a hand auger. "You need vertical posts first. Sink them into the footing stones. Connect them at the top, then nail your boards across horizontal." He looked at the boards she had stacked. "You'll need more lumber. What you have here isn't sufficient." "I know it isn't sufficient." Her voice came out harder than she intended. "It's what I have." Clem considered this. Then he said, "I have some boards in my shed. Not many, but some." She looked at him. He was not offering anything excessive, just stating a fact, as if the presence of boards in his shed, in the shortage of boards at this building site, were a problem of logistics rather than charity, a puzzle rather than a gift. "Why?" she asked. He did not answer right away. He turned the level over in his hands, running his thumb along the edge, the way a person touches something they have used long enough to trust. "My boy worked at this quarry up on Keeney Knob," he said finally. "Strong boy, good worker." He paused in the particular way that pauses sometimes contain more than words do. There was a blast. The charge went wrong. Brought down half the face. Another pause. "My boy was under it." The hollow held the silence between them. "My wife went the winter after. Fever took her fast." He was still looking at the level. "After that, I didn't see the point of much." "What changed?" He set the level down on top of the footing stones parallel to the edge and looked at where the bubble settled. Plum. "I saw your smoke," he said. 3 mornings in a row coming from up here. I knew the place was sitting empty since Ezra passed. I thought someone had moved into squat. Then I came up to look, and I saw you tearing that porch apart, board by board, dragging them down to the cave mouth in the cold." He straightened slowly, his joints registering the movement. "Ezra Calloway was my friend for 18 years. He never finished anything he started, not in all that time. Not because he gave up, but because he couldn't make his hands do what his head knew. He died with those ledgers under the floor, and those footings sitting half buried in leaves. He picked up the level again and held it out to her. He was my friend, and he never got to finish anything. You're his granddaughter, and you're trying to finish what he started. She took the level. It was heavier than it looked. So I'm here, Clem said, because somebody should be. They worked through what remained of that day and into the next and the day after that. Clem came every morning before the light had fully established itself, walking the mile from his cabin with the leather satchel across his shoulder and the careful gait of a man who had made peace with the fact that nothing was going to be easy, but had not made peace with the idea of stopping. He showed her how to split straight posts from tulip poplar trunks using the froe and a mallet, the angle of the blade, the direction of the grain, the sound of a split going right versus the sound of one going wrong. He showed her how to sink the posts into the stone footing, packing split shims around the base until the level confirmed what the eye could not. He showed her how to notch the cross members so they fit without relying entirely on the nails to hold. He showed each thing once. Then he watched while she tried. When she got something wrong, he told her why in the plain language of someone who had learned craft from doing it rather than describing it. Language that went directly at the problem without managing her feelings about the problem. When she got something right, he moved on to the next step without ceremony, which turned out to be its own kind of praise, the confirmation that what she had done was sufficient to build on. Your grandfather understood the physics of this place better than most men with formal educations would have, he said one afternoon, watching her work a cross member into a notch she had cut too tight on the first attempt and had to widen. He knew what the cave was doing and why. He could read a thermometer and tell you what would happen to the temperature in that cabin over a week of cold weather. The cross member seated correctly. He nodded. But watching him try to swing a hammer was a painful thing. The frame went up over the course of 2 weeks. 8 posts sunk into the stone footings at the cave mouth and at intervals marking the corridor's 22-foot length, connected by horizontal cross members at the top, and at mid-height braced against the bluff face on one side and freestanding on the other. It looked skeletal, the bones of something that might one day be a passage, but it was straight, confirmed by the level at every stage, and it was solid in a way that surprised her each time she tested it by pushing against a post. She had built this with her own hands. She had made it stand. Then they started nailing the boards. This was where the gaps in her knowledge showed most plainly. She did not know how much space to leave between boards for the wood's seasonal movement without leaving so much that the wind could find its way through. She did not know how to cut a door frame that would hang true. She did not know how to mix the lime mortar that Clem produced from his kiln shed, lime and sand and water, in proportions that were not instinctive, that required understanding what the mortar was doing chemically rather than just mechanically, why it had to go on thin rather than thick, why it had to cure slowly rather than fast. Too thick, Clem said one morning watching her apply a bead of mortar to a gap between boards. It'll crack when it dries. Mortar under stress contracts as it cures thick layers have more material pulling against itself. The crack propagates through and you've got a gap worse than what you started with. She scraped it back and started again thinner this time the way he had demonstrated. They built the double doors from the remaining boards, fitting them with hardware. Clem pulled from his satchel hinges that had once hung a different door somewhere, a latch mechanism he had been carrying for reasons he did not specify. The baffle vent in the corridor's middle took 3 days of adjustment to get right, a sliding panel of oiled wood that could be opened or closed to control how much cave air mixed with the passage air at any given time, which in turn controlled how much of that mixture reached the cabin. By the time they finished sealing the last joint, a thin bead of mortar along the top edge of the outermost doorframe applied with the patience that Clem had drilled into her over the preceding weeks, the temperature had dropped steadily. The hollow held cold the way hollows do, collecting it from the ridge tops, funneling it down to the lowest point. Wren closed the doors in the correct sequence, outer door first, then inner door, and stood inside the cabin looking at the interior door that connected to the corridor. She could feel the difference already, less of the outside cold reaching her directly, something between her and it. But the real test was what she did not yet feel. She was waiting. She went to sleep without knowing whether it had worked. On the 4th morning and after they had finished, she had checked the doors twice each morning and twice each night had retightened 2 of the mortar seams that had developed fine hairline cracks in the first cold snap and needed to be redone with thinner layers, applied more patiently. She woke before dawn to a cabin colder than any morning before it. She could see her breath in the dark above the bed. She lay still for a moment, then sat up and crossed to the wash basin on the shelf above the stove. She reached in. Her fingers touched water, cold enough that her hand registered the temperature as a kind of protest, but water. Not ice, not the solid surface her fingers had found every morning for the past week. She stood in the dark with her hand in the basin. Outside, through the gap at the bottom of the shutter, she could see the blue-white light of heavy frost on the ground. Everything out there had gone still and crystalline in the night, the way things go when the temperature has dropped below the point where ordinary weather operates. The water in her basin was 48 degrees, maybe 50. She did not have a thermometer small enough to measure it precisely, but it was liquid. She crossed to the corridor door. On the other side of it, she could feel something different, a quality of air that was not warm exactly, but that had a different relationship to her skin than the air in the cabin did. Not hostile, not trying to take something from her. She opened the door. The corridor stretched away from her in the pre-dawn gray 22 feet of boards she had nailed with her own hands, mortar she had mixed wrong, and then right posts Clem had shown her how to set. At the far end, through the second door, she could see the black mouth of the cave. From it, moving toward her with the patience of something that had been doing this for longer than she could calculate, came air. Cave air. 52 degrees of it, 53, the mountain's steady exhalation flowing through the passage she had built to receive it. It was not warm, she kept her coat on, but it was constant in a way that fire was not steady, in a way that wood and iron could not be patient, in a way that only stone could be patient, because stone had been practicing patience since before there were words for it. She walked into the corridor and stood in it. The air moved past her like a slow river, unhurried, indifferent to the killing cold 20 feet away on the other side of the outer door. She put her palm flat against the wall and felt the stone footings through the boards, felt the mass of the bluff behind them all, that compressed limestone, holding its temperature, the way it had been holding it when Ezra Calloway first measured it in 1867, the way it would hold it long after anything either of them had built here had returned to the ground. She sat down on the floor of the corridor, cross-legged on the boards she had nailed herself, and put her face in her hands. She laughed once, a short surprise sound, the kind that comes out when something you feared was impossible turns out to simply be very hard. Then the tears came, and she let them, because there was no one to see them, and because she had been keeping them somewhere inconvenient for a long time, and they deserved somewhere better. When Clem arrived that morning, she was still sitting on the corridor floor. He came through the outer door and stood in the passage and looked at her. Then he looked at the thermometer he had nailed to the inside wall of the corridor the day before. 53 degrees. His voice was quiet, with something in it she had not heard before. Ezra was right. He looked at the cave mouth at the far end of the corridor, then back at her. He was right all along. And you built it. We built it, Wren said. He sat down beside her on the corridor floor. Two people in a passage made of salvaged porch boards and thin-coated mortar, sitting in the breath of a mountain that had been waiting for someone to open the door. For a long time, neither of them said anything more. The cave exhaled steadily around them, constant as a promise. It was the first morning since she had arrived at Blackthorn Gap that Wren Calloway felt she might not die here. The first winter taught Wren that 53 degrees was not warmth. It was survival wearing a different coat. She had expected in some naive corner of her thinking that once the corridor worked, the hard part would be finished. What she discovered instead was that building the system had been the straightforward problem, the one with a blueprint, a set of ledgers, a clear set of steps between where she was and where she needed to be. Living inside the system was more complicated. The corridor buffered the cabin against killing cold, but it did not make the cabin comfortable. On the coldest nights of that first December, she slept in her coat with both blankets pulled over her and still woke at 3 in the morning with cold feet. The stove needed tending every 4 hours, or the temperature inside dropped faster than the corridor could compensate. She learned to wake without an alarm, her body calibrating itself to the rhythm of the fire, the way it might calibrate to a nursing child, alert to need before the need became critical. What the corridor gave her was margin. Not warmth, but the difference between a situation that required constant emergency response and one that merely required consistent attention. She used less than half the wood she had calculated she would need, burning through the old collapsed woodpile slowly, rather than desperately extending what she had into something that might last until she could cut more. The distinction between desperation and consistency was not dramatic, but it was the distinction between surviving the winter and not surviving it. Clem came most days through December, though the walk from his cabin had grown harder as the cold deepened. His cough had worsened, not dramatically, not the kind of worsening that announced itself, but the kind that accumulated quietly 1 degree worse each week, so that looking back you could not identify the day it had changed, but only the distance between where it had been and where it was now. He never mentioned it. He arrived, assessed whatever she was working on, offered what she needed to know, drank the thin chicory coffee she had learned to make palatable, if not good, and walked back down the hollow before dark. He taught her to read the corridor the way she might read a person through accumulation of small signals rather than single obvious declarations. When the baffle vent developed a particular low hum in the late afternoon cold, was coming down from the ridge tops, and would reach the hollow floor by midnight. When the outer door resisted slightly on its hinges in a way it had not the day before, the wood had swelled with moisture, which meant snow within 24 hours. When the cave air moving through the passage had a faintly different quality, harder to name than temperature closer to pressure. A front was shifting somewhere above the mountains, and the hollow would feel it within a day. The mountain was speaking in a register she was only beginning to hear. What your grandfather understood, Clem told her one afternoon, watching her adjust the baffle panel with the careful attention she had developed for, it was that this place has been having the same conversation with itself for 10,000 years. You're not changing what it does. You're just learning to listen. She carried those words with her into January. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was not exceptional by West Virginia standards, which meant it was severe by most other measures. 3 weeks in January when the temperature did not rise above 20 degrees even at midday. A February ice storm that coated the hollow in a quarter-inch of clear ice and made the walk to the spring so treacherous she fashioned crude crampons from strips of leather and bent nails. A March cold snap that arrived after 2 weeks of false thaw and caught half the valley's farmers in the middle of planting decisions they then had to unmake. Through all of it, the corridor held. The cabin stayed above 38 degrees on the worst nights, above 42 on ordinary cold ones. Her water did not freeze. Her stored food, what little she had, did not spoil in the cave's steady cool. She burned through the old woodpile at a rate that left her with a third of it remaining when April arrived, which meant she had 3 times more wood than she had needed. That surplus was not comfort. It was data. She wrote the numbers in a ledger of her own, the 15th in the series that Ezra had begun, though she did not think of it that way until later. Temperature at the cave mouth each morning at sunrise. Temperature inside the cabin at the same time. Temperature outside in the yard. Wood consumed each week. She was adding to what he had started, the way a conversation continues after one person has had to leave the room. Spring came to Blackthorn Gap like an apology, tentative, a little guilty about what winter had done, arriving in installments rather than all at once. First the sound of the spring running full again after months of near silence. Then chickweed, then wood sorrel, then the tulip poplars putting out their first leaves in the yellow-green. That is so specific to early spring, it has almost no analog in other seasons. Wren used the thaw to do what she had been planning through the coldest weeks: expand the storage alcove. She had proved to herself that the cave mouth kept food cooler than any root cellar in the valley. Now she widened the space just inside the cave entrance, shoring the sides with flat limestone. She split from the bluff face using a technique Clem had shown her, a hammer and a steel wedge, reading the grain of the rock the way you read wood grain, finding where it wanted to separate. The alcove she built was not large, perhaps 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide, but it was enough to store a significant quantity of root vegetables, and the temperature inside it in July, she checked it twice a day for a week, to be certain held at 51 degrees. She planted potatoes in the rocky soil of the hollow floor in May, in beds she had spent April improving with leaf mold from under the hemlock stands. She planted onions. She planted turnips in the shadier corners, where the soil held moisture longer. The garden was not productive by any standard. A valley farmer would have recognized the soil was thin. The light was limited by the bluff. The growing season at this elevation was shorter than it was 3 miles away in Cinder Hollow. But it was something growing in ground that had not grown anything since Ezra died. She dug the potatoes in July, carried them into the cave alcove, laid them in the cool dark, went back to her other work. In September, she checked them. Smooth, firm, no soft spots, no eyes reaching toward non-existent light. They looked like potatoes dug last week. The walk into Cinder Hollow felt different that morning. She was carrying a basket of potatoes that should not have looked the way they looked in September, in a place that had no ice house and no salt to spare. Ida Fenn took one from the basket, turned it over in her hands, with the suspicious thoroughness of someone who expects to find the trick before it finds her, pressed her thumb against the skin. These came from your cave. Not a question, a theory being tested. From the alcove just inside it, temperature stays around 50 degrees year-round. Ida turned the potato over again. A long moment passed in which Wren could watch the woman's practical intelligence working against her inclination toward skepticism, the two forces balancing and then tipping. 2 cents each for the potatoes, 5 for the onions. She reached for her ledger, the same one she had used to record the cornmeal debt in November. Different page, different calculation. This one in Wren's favor. Walking back to the hollow with coins in her coat pocket, Wren counted them twice. Not from disbelief, from the particular satisfaction of a number that had changed sign from negative to positive, from debt to something that might eventually accumulate into options. Word spread through Cinder Hollow, the way word always spread through small places laterally through the connective tissue of daily interaction, carried in the margins of conversations about other things. By October of 1887, Wren had requests from 3 families before she had gone looking for any. Gideon Rourke was the first to come to the hollow himself rather than sending word through Ida Fenn. He was a large, careful man, a widower with 3 children whose farm occupied a stretch of bottomland south of town that was good soil but vulnerable to the wet rot that attacked root vegetables in a wet autumn. He had lost nearly half his turnip harvest the previous year to that rot. He stood in Wren's yard with his hat in both hands, a gesture she recognized as the physical form of asking for something you were not sure you deserved. And his proposal was straightforward. Bring his surplus turnips to her cave alcove, split whatever survived the winter on a 50-50 basis. She walked him through the corridor first. She had found that people needed to feel the air moving before they could believe what she told them about it. He stood in the passage with his hands held out at his sides, palms down, the way a person stands when they are trying to feel something they are not sure is there. Then it reached him, that steady exhale of cool, constant air, and his hands dropped to his sides, and he stood very still. It's always this temperature. The skepticism had not left his voice entirely, but it had shifted register from disbelief to verification. Within 2 degrees year-round. Warmer in deep winter relative to outside air, cooler in summer relative to outside air. The rock doesn't change much. That's the point. He brought the turnips 3 days later. A full wagon, more than she had space for in the current alcove. She turned away the overflow without apology. She was not equipped yet for more than she could properly manage, and she would not promise what she could not deliver. He accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had learned that partial solutions were still solutions. By November of that first year of trading, Wren had the root vegetables of 6 families stored in the cave alcove negotiated on shares. She had repaid the cornmeal debt to Ida Fenn. She had purchased 3 additional ledger books, a new hammer to replace Ezra's rusted one, 2 pounds of dried beans, a small quantity of salt pork, enough cornmeal to last through March. Her financial position had moved from the edge of catastrophe to something that could be described with some generosity as precarious stability. Harlan Voss came on a Wednesday afternoon in late November when the light in the hollow went early, and the cold had established itself as a permanent condition rather than a temporary inconvenience. She heard the horse before she saw him. The hollow carried sound from the upper trail in a way she had learned to read, and she was outside the cabin when he came around the last bend. The gray horse, the coat that cost more than her total assets. He did not dismount. This detail registered as intentional. He stated his offer with the directness of someone accustomed to offers being accepted. $12 for the tract. More than Ezra had paid. More than anyone else would give her, he was certain to note. It's not for sale. Her voice came out without inflection, which was different from calm, but sometimes functioned the same way. Everything is for sale, Miss Calloway. The question is always what price. He looked at the corridor at the cave mouth beyond the outer door at the bluff rising above it all. This isn't farmland. It isn't timber. The rock won't yield to the plow, and the trees on the slope are too small to be worth harvesting. What you have here is a hole in a cliff in a cabin that won't survive 3 more winters without a new roof. The last person who explained my future to me was Mrs. Dorothea Marsh of the Greenbrier County Relief Home. She was aware of the quality of the stillness around her, the hollow holding its breath, the cold air motionless between them. She called what I inherited a box of wind in a house built against a grave. She did not gesture. She did not point. She simply let the corridor stand behind her and the bluff stand above it and the silence say the rest. Voss's expression did not change exactly, but something in it recalibrated. He had come expecting a girl who needed persuading. He had encountered something harder to categorize. Winter's coming, Miss Calloway. Real winter, not the moderate season we had last year. He gathered his reins with the unhurried confidence of a man who had time on his side. When that cabin breaks open in February and you're burning wet wood by candlelight, you'll have occasion to reconsider. I might. She held the stillness the way the stone held its temperature, not by force but by mass. But I'll reconsider from here. He rode out of the hollow without another word. She watched the bend in the track for some time after the sound of the horse had faded, not from concern, but from the habit of paying attention to exits as carefully as entrances. Harlan Voss had time. Men like him always had time. She had something he did not have a name for yet, which was the knowledge that the mountain's steadiness had a longer timeline than anyone's patience. She spent the second winter refining. The baffle vent she had built from Ezra's design worked, but it worked crudely. She could open it or close it, roughly control the flow, but she could not fine-tune the mixture of cave air and corridor air the way the 12th Ledger's more detailed sketches had suggested was possible. She built a secondary sliding panel inside the first offset by 6 inches, so that the two panels together created an adjustable gap rather than a binary open or closed. The improvement was not large, but it was real. She could feel the difference in the corridor's behavior on mornings when the outside temperature was in transition, neither deep cold nor mild, when the cave air at 53 degrees was actually warmer than ideal for comfort. Clem sat on the stone footings one afternoon in February, watching her adjust the panels, moving them in small increments, and then standing still to feel the result. And his voice carried something she had come to recognize as his version of satisfaction. You're learning to have a conversation with it. I'm learning its vocabulary, she said. The conversation is already happening. I'm just late to it. He was quieter that winter than he had been the first. Not withdrawn, Clem Osgood had never been a talker in the social sense, but he had always been present, attentive. His silence, the productive kind that meant he was thinking rather than absent. What she noticed was a different quality of quietness, closer to economy than contemplation. He chose his words the way a man chooses tools when he is not sure how many trips he has left in him. One afternoon, mixing a small batch of mortar for a seam she had found working loose on the corridor's north wall, she asked him directly, "How is your chest?" He looked at her with a clear eye. "The quarry dust doesn't leave," he said. 30 years of breathing stone. It settles and it stays. He took the trowel from the mortar bucket and turned it over in his hands, a gesture she had seen many times, the habitual motion of a craftsman checking a tool. The stone is patient about it, takes its time. She did not ask again. Some answers are complete in themselves. Spring of 1888 came, and she expanded the alcove again, adding 4 feet of depth. She built a second shelf along the north wall using limestone slabs she fitted together without mortar, dry stacked in the technique Clem had shown her the previous summer. The shelves held onions through October without a single one going soft. This seemed to her like the kind of miracle that was actually just physics, which she had come to believe was the most durable kind. The surplus from that second season was larger than the first, partly because she had more families contributing, and partly because she had learned to manage the cave's resources with the same attention she gave the corridor, monitoring temperature, adjusting airflow through the secondary vent, to maintain the optimal range, rotating stock to ensure that older items were used before newer ones, regardless of which family had stored them. She ran the operation with the methodical attention of someone who understood that systems failed not at their grand moments, but in their small, neglected details. The money she made from shares and trades was not wealth by any measure Harlan Voss would have recognized, but it bought what it needed to buy, and it accumulated in slow increments that she tracked in the back pages of the 15th Ledger. And by the winter of 1888, she had replaced the stove, patched every remaining gap in the cabin walls with the clay and horsehair mixture Clem had taught her, put a new roof on the structure using cedar shingles. She split herself over the course of 2 weeks in late summer and begun to think about the question of the corridor's length. 22 feet connected the cabin to the cave mouth, but the cave itself extended much farther. The 9th Ledger contained maps that showed passages reaching 60, 80, 100 feet into the bluff, before the main chamber opened into a space tall enough to stand in. The temperature at those depths was even more stable than at the entrance. 52 degrees winter or summer with almost no variation. Ezra had noted this in careful entries. The deeper the measurement, the less it changed. She had been using only the first 22 feet of what the mountain offered. She began planning the expansion in the evenings at the table by the window in the cabin, with the 15th ledger open to the back pages, where she was keeping her own engineering notes alongside Ezra's financial figures. The plans were not simple. Extending the corridor deeper into the cave meant dealing with the cave's floor, which was uneven limestone, and its ceiling, which in places came low enough to require careful navigation. It meant additional lumber, more mortar, more time. It meant working in the dark and the cold of the cave interior rather than in daylight. She had none of this yet figured out when Professor Aldous Frick arrived from Lewisburg. He came in March of 1896, by which time Wren had been at Blackthorn Gap for 10 years. She was 26 years old. Her hands, which had been soft enough to blister in her first weeks at the Hollow, had long since developed the calluses of sustained labor, not rough so much as reorganized her skin's response to the particular demands of her work. She had repaired and extended the corridor twice. The cave alcove now reached 40 feet into the bluff. 17 families in the Cinder Hollow Valley had stored food with her through the previous winter. Frick was thin, precise, and carried a notebook the way some men carried weapons, with the air of someone who considered it fundamental equipment. He had traveled 30 miles of bad road from Lewisburg because a colleague's cousin in Cinder Hollow had mentioned in a letter about entirely other matters that there was a woman in a hollow above the town who kept vegetables fresh through the winter, using a cave and whose cabin burned through less wood than any other structure in the valley, and who had apparently inherited the whole arrangement from an eccentric grandfather nobody had taken seriously for 30 years. Frick took her seriously from the first hour. He asked to see the corridor before anything else. He walked its length, slowly stopping at each of the 3 vent panels she had installed: the original baffle from Ezra's design, the secondary panel she had added in the second winter, a third refinement she had built the previous autumn that allowed her to create a slight pressure differential between the corridor and the cabin drawing cave, air more actively through the passage rather than waiting for convection alone to move it. He took the temperature at each panel with his own thermometer, noted the readings, compared them to the readings he had taken at the cave mouth and in the cabin. He asked questions in the patient manner of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than to confirm what he already believed. He read the ledgers over 2 days, all 15 of them, Ezra's 14 and Wren's own. He read them at the table in the cabin with the same complete attention she had given them the first night she found them, which made her feel something she did not have an immediate name for, some combination of vindication and grief that the person sitting at her table was not her grandfather. On the 4th morning, he sat on the stone footings outside the cave mouth. Clem's footings, she still thought of them that way, and looked at the full system with an expression that she would later describe to Thomas Holt as a man watching something settle into place in his head. Your grandfather understood thermal mass and convective airflow better than engineers I've met in Lewisburg with formal training, Frick said. The principle is sound. The application is not only functional, it's elegant. He solved with observation what other men couldn't solve with equations. He shook his head slowly, not in negation, but in the way people shake their heads at things that seem obvious in retrospect and were not. Why does no one know about this except the woman who almost starved before she could prove it? Because my grandfather was poor and strange and lived in a hollow that nobody visited. She was sitting on the other end of the footings, her elbows on her knees. Because people would rather believe someone is crazy than admit they might have been wrong about him. The belief is cheaper than the revision. Frick looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who was adding that sentence to his mental collection of accurate things. He wanted to write a pamphlet explaining the principles, the physics in accessible language, crediting Ezra Calloway as the originator of the design, crediting Wren as the builder who had proved the design worked under real conditions over multiple winters. He wanted to distribute it through the educational network. He was part of the academy system that connected teachers across 3 counties. She said yes without hesitation. The only question she had was why he wanted to do it. Because I'm a teacher, Frick said with the simplicity of someone stating something they had long since stopped feeling the need to justify. There are other hollows, Miss Calloway. Other families living in cabins pressed against limestone bluffs who don't know what the limestone is doing for them. Other people who might survive a hard winter if they knew what you know. He paused. Also, your grandfather deserves to have his name on his work. That seems like a minimum. The circular appears in the spring of 1896. By summer, it had reached readers in Monroe, Greenbrier, and Pocahontas counties. By late summer, Wren had visitors she had not invited: teachers, a county agricultural agent, a man from the State Geological Survey, who wanted to talk about karst formations. She showed each of them what they needed to see answered. What she could answer directed the rest to the relevant ledger pages. Word reached Harlan Voss that fall through whatever channels word reached men like him, and he made no return visit. She heard through Gideon Ruark, who heard it at the feed store, that Voss had told someone the Calloway girl had gotten lucky with that cave, as if 30 years of Ezra's work and 10 years of her own were a fortunate accident rather than a sustained argument made in stone. She did not find this surprising. Some people could not afford to understand certain things. The cost of understanding was too high. It would require revising too many prior conclusions. By the autumn of 1898, 23 families stored food in systems she had helped them build, or in the cave itself. The corridor had been replicated in simpler forms in 4 other hollows in the county, each one tailored to the specific bluff and specific cabin it served. Frick had written a second circular that year, more technical than the first, which had found its way into the reading list of at least one engineering course in Morgantown that someone mentioned to her in a letter she was not certain how to answer. The harvest that autumn was a good one. Fat turnips, heavy potatoes, onions that had cured well in the August heat. The woodpiles in Cinder Hollow looked full. The wells were running. At the general store, people talked about the coming winter with the comfortable confidence of people who had prepared. Owen Cypher arrived on the 2nd day of February, 1899, just before the light gave out. She heard the footsteps on the hollow track before she heard anything else. A specific rhythm that was not Clem's measured gait or Gideon Ruark's heavier tread. Fast, uneven, the gait of someone moving with urgency but without panic, the careful speed of a man who knew that falling on frozen ground at this hour in this weather was a problem he could not afford. She was already at the cabin door when he came around the bend. Owen Cypher had been trapping the ridges above Cinder Hollow for 30 years. He was a lean, weathered man with ice crystals in his beard that had not melted despite what had clearly been hard travel, which told her the temperature, even on the south-facing slope, was below the point where exertion warmed you sufficiently to melt ice on your face. His eyes had the quality of eyes that had been watching something alarming for some time. "There's weather coming." His voice was steady, a man who dealt in facts rather than drama. Blue steel sky to the north, pressure dropping like a stone thrown off a cliff. "I've been reading these mountains for 30 years, Miss Calloway, and I've never felt the air go wrong this fast." He glanced at the corridor at the cave beyond the outer door. "You're the one with the cave house." "I am." "Then you might be all right." He said it as if completing a calculation he had been running in his head during the walk down from the ridge. "Everyone else better pray they've got enough wood to burn for a month." He turned to go because he had more ground to cover before dark, more people to warn in the miles between here and town. "I've never been wrong about weather," he said, already moving away. "I wanted you to know I've never been wrong." She stood in the doorway long after the sound of his footsteps had faded, looking at the sky above the bluff's rim. The color to the north was wrong. Not the ordinary gray of winter cloud cover, not the purple-edged darkness of a coming snowstorm. Steel blue, almost luminous, the color of something very cold, moving with purpose. She went inside. She lit the lamp. She opened the 15th ledger to the current page and wrote down the date, the time, and what Owen Cypher had told her. Then she wrote, "Barometric pressure cannot measure directly, but the cave air is moving faster than it should be for current outside temperature. Differential increasing. The mountain knows something." The next morning she took down what remained of the old porch, the last few boards she had left in place, because they formed a sheltered area outside the cabin door where she could leave wet boots. She had been planning to rebuild the porch properly in the spring, extend it, put a railing on it. That spring had not come yet, and these boards were needed now for the outer section of the corridor. The portion she had been planning to add the extension that would create a second set of doors at the outer end and give the whole system an additional layer of separation between the living space and the exterior air. She had the plans. She had done the measurements the previous summer. She had not yet done the work. Clem appeared at noon. He was using a walking staff she had not seen him use before. Not decorative, but a length of straight hickory. He had stripped of bark and fitted at the base with an iron ferrule, the kind a man makes when he has decided that pride is not worth the risk of falling on frozen ground. He carried it with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who has assessed the situation clearly and chosen the practical response. "I heard about the weather," he said, "from Gideon Ruark, who heard from the Fen boy, who heard from someone at the blacksmith." He looked at the boards she had stacked. "You're building the outer section." I need to have it done before the front arrives. He looked at the sky, looked at the boards, looked at her. Then we better start. They worked through the afternoon without stopping, except for the periods when Clem's cough demanded it. He would raise one hand, the staff planted in the frozen ground beside him, and stand with his head bowed for as long as it took, then straighten and resume without comment or apology. She did not comment either. They had reached the point in their working relationship where they communicated mostly through the work itself, through the efficiency of two people who knew the same techniques and trusted each other's judgment about when something was done correctly. The outer section was shorter than the inner corridor, 12 feet rather than 22, designed to create a protected entrance vestibule before the main passage. The framing went up in the afternoon. The boarding took until dark. By lantern light, they mixed the mortar and applied it. Wren working the interior joints while Clem worked the exterior ones, the two of them meeting at the seam where the new section joined the old with a precision that came from 10 years of working on the same structure. By the time the mortar had been applied and they had fitted the outer doors in their frame, new doors built over the previous 2 weeks from boards she had milled herself, fitted with proper weather stripping. Cut from oiled leather, it was well past midnight. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since they had started in the afternoon. The stars visible through the gap between the bluff top and the tree canopy to the south had the hard, close brightness of very cold air. The outer section was not perfect. Working by lantern light at below zero temperatures with a man whose hands shook from fatigue, she knew the seams were not as carefully done as the interior sections she had applied in daylight over days rather than hours. There were places she had gone over twice because she could see the mortar had not seated correctly the first time. There were places she could not get a second pass on because Clem was working from the other direction, and they had met in the middle, and the joint was sealed even if not as well as she would have liked. She checked each door 3 times, set the outer latch, opened and closed the inner one. The system worked. She could feel the difference in the vestibule space immediately, the air in it warmer than the exterior air by several degrees, even before she opened the inner door and let the cave's breath reach it. Standing in the outer vestibule with the lamp in her hand and the cold pressing against the new boards on every side, she thought it will hold or it will not. She had done what she could do in the time she had. The mountain would hold what it held. The storm arrived the following afternoon. She did not see it arrive so much as hear it a change in the sound of the hollow, as if the hollow itself had changed shape. Then the wind hit the bluff face with a sound she had no prior reference for, a sustained low roar that was both louder than thunder and more monotonous, a sound without drama because drama implies variation. This was constant. This was the sound of something that had decided on a direction and was committed. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 3 hours. By nightfall, the cabin thermometer read 8 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, she could not read it accurately because the lamp was producing less light than usual. Something in the air pressure was affecting the flame, though she could not have explained the mechanism. She estimated 5 degrees, perhaps 3. The wood stove required a full basket of kindling to hold the cabin at 38 degrees, which alarmed her until she remembered that the corridor was doing the heavy work and the stove was only managing the gap between what the corridor provided and what was livable. At 38 degrees, you could function. You could think. You could plan the next thing. Clem had stayed the night she had offered without making it a question, because there was no version of him walking a mile in this wind at his age that did not end badly. He slept in the chair by the stove, his coat across his knees, the hickory staff leaning against the wall beside him. She checked on him twice during the night without waking him, because the discipline of not disturbing a sleeping person was one of the few courtesies she had been careful to maintain. On the 3rd day, Gideon Ruark appeared at the outer vestibule door, his youngest child bundled against him in a way that made the child look like a parcel, rather than a person, his face showing the particular expression of a man who has been proud for 3 days and has run out of pride. He had burned through 1/3 of his woodpile. The temperature in his farmhouse had dropped to 22 degrees that morning, which was the temperature at which certain things began to happen to pipes and to people. She opened the door. "Bring the child in first." She did not say she had told him so. She did not say anything except practical things, where to put the child where there was room to sit, that the stove was maintained at a specific temperature, and that the corridor door should stay closed unless she opened it. Gideon nodded at each instruction with the brevity of a man conserving something. He came back the next morning with his 2 older children. He came back the morning after that with his neighbor. By the end of the first week, 7 families had found their way to the hollow, drawn by the news that traveled through a community in crisis, the way water travels through limestone, finding every available channel moving toward lower pressure. Word that the cave house was holding. Word that there was a place in the hollow where the temperature had not dropped below 40 degrees. The corridor was not designed to shelter families. She had not built guest accommodations into the mountain's breathing system. What she had built was a passage and alcove, a cabin with a stove that burned efficiently, walls that did not leak a roof. She had replaced herself 3 years ago. People slept in the corridor. Children sat in the alcove where the vegetables were stored, which was warmer than the corridor because the cave air reached it more directly. Adults took turns at the cabin floor space, with the pragmatism of people who had stopped having preferences. Clem watched it all from the chair by the stove, which had become his fixed position. He was warm for the first time in days, which she suspected was doing more for his cough than anything else. The cold had been working on it steadily, and the warmth of the crowded cabin seemed to slow the process somewhat, or at least stop it from accelerating. He watched the families arrange themselves around his friend's cabin, with an expression she had learned to read as something in the territory between satisfaction and sorrow. "I used to think Ezra was wasting himself out here," he said one evening quietly enough that only she could hear it over the noise of several families in a small space. "I helped him with the footings with the lintel, but I thought the whole idea was a man's way of hiding from the world with a good excuse." She was stirring soup, the last of the stored vegetables extended with water, and the dried beans she had put up in October stretched thin for as many mouths as it needed to reach. "What do you think now?" He looked at the corridor door at the bluff, visible through the small window she had cut in the corridor's north wall the previous summer to allow monitoring of the outside temperature without opening the doors. "I think he knew something the world wasn't ready to listen to," Clem said. "I think he'd have given every one of these people the same soup you're giving them. He was that kind of man." A pause the length of a breath. "I think I was wrong to call it hiding." Outside, the wind had not let up. Inside, the mountain breathed at 53 degrees, indifferent to the argument. It was winning. The 18th day was when the storm stopped being weather and became something closer to a verdict. The wind had not relented. It had settled into a sustained roar that ceased to register as sound after the first week and became instead a condition of existence, like the cold itself. Not something you heard anymore, but something you moved through. Something that had colonized the background of every thought. The families in the cabin had stopped talking about the wind on day 9. By day 15, they had stopped noticing the absence of talk about it, which was its own kind of adaptation. People accustomed themselves to catastrophe with a speed that was both admirable and unsettling. The cabin held 31 people on the night the seam opened. Wren had been tracking the pressure in the outer vestibule section by feel since the 3rd day of the storm, in the way she had learned to track everything about the corridor, through accumulation of small signals, through the difference between how things felt on ordinary days versus how they felt now. The outer section, built in a single desperate night from boards that were not quite the right thickness, sealed with mortar applied too quickly by 2 people working past exhaustion, had been developing a particular quality of resonance in the lower left corner seam. Not a sound exactly, more like an intention. The cold was finding something to work on. On the 18th night, it found it. The sound reached her through the sleep she had been taking in 2-hour segments in the corridor itself, leaning against the inner wall with her coat around her. A high, sustained note, not loud but persistent. The kind of sound that a gap in a seal makes when pressure drives air through it at velocity. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, her body making the decision before her mind had assembled the relevant information. The lower left corner of the outer vestibule's north wall, a seam she had gone over twice in the lantern light of the construction night, a seam she had not been satisfied with, but had run out of time to address properly. The mortar there had cured in the wrong conditions, too cold, too fast, the chemical process interrupted before completion, and now it was failing. A hairline become a gap, become a whistle. Outside air was driving through it at whatever velocity the wind was currently maintaining, which she estimated based on the sound the bluff made when it deflected wind at somewhere above 40 miles per hour. She did not wake the families in the cabin. She took the hammer, the mortar bucket, the lamp, a strip of sheet iron she kept stored in the alcove for exactly this category of emergency, and she went into the outer vestibule and closed the inner door behind her. Clem was already there. She did not know how he had heard it from the cabin. His cough had been so bad the past 3 days that she had doubted his capacity to hear anything below a certain volume. But he was in the vestibule when she pushed through the inner door, standing with his lamp in one hand and the length of sheet iron in the other, because he had looked at the same seam on the same night they had built it and arrived at the same conclusion about where the failure would come from. His hands shook. Not from cold, the vestibule was around 34 degrees, which was cold enough, but not the kind of cold that produced that particular tremor. The shaking was the product of 10 days of insufficient sleep in a chair of a winter that had been working on his lungs since October of 72 years of accumulated wear on a body that had spent most of those years doing hard things. He held the sheet iron steady despite the shaking, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of man he was. They worked without speaking because there was nothing to say that the work itself did not say more efficiently. She held the lamp while he fitted the iron over the compromised seam, bending its edge into the gap, with the practiced economy of someone who had been solving structural problems for 50 years. She applied the mortar over the iron in thin, careful layers, each one pressed into place with her thumb, rather than a trowel because the gap was narrow enough that the trowel could not reach the interior. Between each layer, she waited 30 seconds, not long enough for proper curing. Nowhere near long enough, but enough for the layer to set sufficiently that the next one would adhere to it rather than sliding off. 3 layers. She pressed the last one flat, ran her thumb along the edge of the iron to seal the joint between metal and mortar, held her palm flat against the wall for a full minute to feel whether the whistle continued. Silence. Not the silence of the vestibule at normal times, which was the silence of a buffer, a space between two pressures. The particular silence of a seal holding against what was trying to get through it. She looked at the cabin thermometer she had hung on the vestibule wall at eye height. 41 degrees. The seam repair had taken 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, with the gap admitting outside air at velocity, the vestibule temperature had dropped 9 degrees. The corridor temperature, which she could see through the small window she had cut in the inner door for exactly this purpose, read 47. The cave was still breathing. The mountain had not noticed the emergency. Clem lowered himself onto the wooden box she kept in the vestibule for sitting when she needed to monitor the doors through long temperature swings. His hands were still shaking. He set them flat on his thighs and looked at the repaired seam with the evaluating attention of a craftsman who knew the difference between work that was done and work that would hold. "It'll hold through tonight," he said. "Tomorrow you should strip it and do the whole section properly." Tomorrow. She was still standing, lamp in hand. The mortar smell was sharp in the enclosed space, chemical and mineral. "Thank you for being awake." He looked at her with the clear eye. "I wasn't asleep." He did not explain further, but she understood there were people who watched things who carried awareness of a system's vulnerabilities, even in sleep, who could not fully put down the responsibility of knowing. She had become one of those people over the past decade. Apparently, Clem had always been one. She restripped the seam the next morning and applied 3 proper layers with 30-minute curing intervals between each. The wind howled on the other side of the boards while she worked. She could feel it through her palms when she pressed against the wall, a sustained vibration, the cold's persistence translated into mechanical energy. The families inside the cabin were quieter now than they had been at the storm's beginning. 31 people in a small space for 18 days produced a specific kind of exhaustion that was not physical but relational. The exhaustion of proximity, of having no distance from other people's breathing, their fears, their small habits. She managed the space the way she managed the corridor, through consistent attention, through anticipating the failures before they occurred, through keeping the temperature stable, so that the human variables had one fewer thing to destabilize them. Ida Fenn's youngest had stopped coughing by day 12. The damp cold that had been working on him in the Fenn house on the edge of town had no purchase in this air. Gideon Rourke's older children had taken over the task of carrying water from the spring each morning, which freed Wren for other work. Small competencies emerged in confined spaces in the way that people discovered their usefulness when usefulness had a clear context. On the 20th day, the Dunmore family arrived. She recognized Mrs. Dunmore before the woman recognized her. The hollow outside the vestibule door had a way of announcing people before they announced themselves, and Wren had learned to read footsteps in the track, the way she read everything else about this place. 3 people, 1 adult woman, 2 children, moving with the careful urgency of people who had been cold for long enough to make warmth into an emergency. When the outer vestibule door opened and Mrs. Dunmore stepped in with her 2 children pressed against her sides, the recognition took perhaps 5 seconds, the time required for eyes adjusting to the lamplight, to find a face they had not seen in nearly 15 years, then to reconcile that face with the woman who had been a girl. A particular girl, one they had returned to the relief home because she argued about leaking roofs. Mrs. Dunmore's face went through several things quickly. Wren watched them pass without helping. "You're the girl we had." The voice was smaller than the memory of it. "The one who you read too much." "I'm the girl you sent back," Wren said with no particular heat in it, just the plain geometry of what had happened. "Yes, I still read too much. That's why this place works." She opened the inner corridor door. "Bring the children through. The alcove on the left has space." She did not require an apology. She did not have the architecture for it. At that moment, 30 people in her cabin, a seam she had repaired 8 hours ago. Clem's cough getting steadily worse, the storm showing no indication of remorse. What she had capacity for was function. Function was what she offered. Mrs. Dunmore moved her children through the corridor with a particular quality of motion. The constrained gratitude of someone who understands they are in no position to negotiate the terms of their rescue. She did not look at Wren again immediately. Wren did not require that she do so. The night of the 22nd day, Clem called her over to the chair by the stove. The cabin was full of sleeping people on the floor in the corridor, 2 families who had brought their own bedrolls arranged in the alcove with the remaining vegetable stores. The stove had been running for 3 weeks on a diet of carefully rationed wood that should not have been sufficient, but was because the corridor was doing the work the stove would otherwise have had to do alone. "I want you to know something." His voice was low enough that the sleeping families did not stir. The cough had changed quality in the past 3 days, deeper, less frequent, but more effortful, a sound like something being slowly convinced. "I want you to know that when I came up here, the first time I didn't come because I thought your grandfather's idea would work. I came because I had watched a man spend 30 years working on something that mattered to him, and he never got to see it mean anything to anyone else. I came because I was tired of useful things going to waste." She was sitting on the floor beside the chair with her back against the wall, the 15th ledger open on her knees to a page of temperature readings. She did not write anything for a moment. "Did you think it would work?" she asked. "After you saw the system?" He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. His expression had the quality of someone working out how honest to be, then deciding that honesty was the only currency still worth carrying at his age. "I thought it might work in ordinary cold," he said. "I did not think it would work in this." She looked at the corridor door. On the other side of it, the mountain was breathing at 53 degrees as it had been breathing since before either of them were alive, as it would breathe after both of them were gone. Consistent, unconcerned with what was happening on the surface. Patient in the way that only old things are patient because they have had sufficient time to understand that patience is not passive. It is the most active force there is if you can sustain it long enough. "Neither did I," she admitted. "Not completely." Clem made a sound that might have been a laugh if his chest had been in better condition. It came out instead as a brief exhale with a shape to it. "Your grandfather would have known," he said. "He would have run the numbers and been certain. That was always the difference between the two of you in my imagination. He knew. You built." "Knowing without building is a journal under a floorboard," Wren said. Clem was quiet for a moment. "Then write that down." She wrote it down. The 27th day brought Mrs. Dorothea Marsh. Wren was in the corridor, checking the secondary vent panel, when she heard the outer vestibule door open. She had been expecting no one. Gideon Rourke's 2 older children had gone out that morning for water and wood and had not yet returned, but their footsteps she knew. These were different. Tentative. The footsteps of someone moving carefully, not because of ice, but because of uncertainty about their reception. She opened the inner corridor door. Mrs. Marsh had shrunk. This was Wren's first coherent thought, not that she was older, not that she looked afraid, but that she had diminished in some physical way that 15 years could not fully account for. The steel-gray hair was hidden under a wool cap. The certainty that had been such a structural feature of her face was absent, leaving something that looked exposed the way a building looks when the facing comes off. She had brought 2 girls from the relief home, young, perhaps 12, perhaps 13. Their faces tight with cold, and the particular watchfulness of children who have learned to read adult situations for their own safety. Miss Calloway, the voice she had spent years hearing in her memory, smaller now than the memory of it. "I came to ask for shelter for the girls. Bring them in." Wren stepped back from the doorway. Children first. She got the girls settled in the alcove with a blanket and the last of the dried apple slices she had been rationing. Mrs. Marsh stood in the corridor after the children had passed through, looking at the full length of the passage, the boards, the mortar joints, the vent panels, the temperature gauge she had mounted on the north wall, the cave mouth visible at the far end. Looking at what the box of wind looked like in practice. It works, Mrs. Marsh said. Not as an observation exactly, more as a sentence a person says when the evidence requires them to revise something fundamental. It works. The woman's hands moved in her coat pockets, a searching gesture, the hands of someone trying to find something they had carried for a long time. She drew out an envelope. The paper had gone soft with age and handling the ink on the front faded but legible Wren Calloway, care of Greenbrier County Relief Home, Lewisburg, West Virginia. Ezra Calloway wrote to me, Mrs. Marsh said. After your mother died, he asked me to send you to him. He sent $10 for the rail fare and the wagon from Alderton. She was looking at the envelope rather than at Wren. I thought the place was unfit. I thought he was unsound. A pause in which the corridor breathed steadily around them, the mountain indifferent to human accounting. I deposited the money in the house account. I kept the letter. I never told you it had come. Every sleeping family in the cabin had someone awake. Wren could feel the quality of the listening through the inner corridor door, the particular silence of people pretending to sleep. The Dunmores, Gideon Ruark, Ida Fenn's husband, who had finally come on day 22, when his wife's repeated accounts of what she had seen here overcame whatever had kept him away. All of them were listening to a woman explain why a girl had been kept from the one person in the world who had been looking for her. I thought I was protecting you from an eccentric old man in an uninhabitable hollow, Mrs. Marsh continued. The formality was leaving her voice as she spoke, the way formal things leave voices when they are no longer sustainable. I understand now that I was protecting myself from the possibility that I was wrong about what was suitable. Those are different things. I confused them. Her voice did not break exactly, but it thinned. I am sorry. I am sorry I kept you from him. I am sorry he died without knowing you. Wren looked at the envelope for a long moment. The handwriting on the front was the same small, cramped hand she knew from 14 ledgers, the hand of a man who had learned to write when paper was expensive. She did not open it. She knew what was inside, not the specific words, but the category of words, because she had read their echo in every page of the ledgers, every temperature measurement, every carefully reasoned engineering sketch that had spent 2 years under a floorboard waiting for someone to find them. She took the envelope, held it. I forgive you, she said. The words came out level without performance. Not because your choice was right, because I will not spend the rest of my life carrying the shape of it. Mrs. Marsh nodded. The tears on her face she did not wipe away either from dignity or from some recognition that they were appropriate, and she had no right to remove them quickly. The girls can stay, Wren said. You can stay as long as the storm runs. She turned back to the vent panel she had been checking when the outer door had opened. She adjusted the secondary slide a 1/4 inch. The airflow in the corridor shifted almost imperceptibly, a fraction of a degree, a slight change in the quality of the air moving past her face. She noted it. She noted everything. The storm broke on the 32nd day. Not dramatically. No sudden cessation of wind, no theatrical clearing of skies. The cold simply stopped pressing quite as hard, the way very strong things sometimes simply stop, rather than diminishing in stages. The temperature outside rose to 12 degrees, which felt, after a month of temperatures that had stayed below zero for days at a stretch, like an almost embarrassing warmth. The wind dropped to a sustained breeze, and then to intermittent gusts, and then to the ordinary quiet of a winter hollow. The families left in the order they had arrived, roughly the order reversing itself, the way tide reverses gradually, not all at once, each departure leaving slightly more room for those remaining. Most of them said something when they went. Some of it was direct, thank you, I owe you, I will not forget this. Some of it was indirect, pressed into her hands as food as coins, as a small hand-forged tool that Gideon Ruark had apparently been carrying in his coat pocket since day 4, because he had not known what else to bring. Some of them could not look at her directly when they went, and she did not require that they could. The Dunmore family left on day 34. Mrs. Dunmore paused at the outer vestibule door with her 2 children already through it, already in the cold of the hollow's ordinary morning. I want to say something. Her voice had the quality of words that had been rehearsed, then abandoned, then decided on again. What I did sending you back, I told myself it was because you argued, because you were difficult. Wren waited. It was because you were right about the roof. The water damage cost us 2 winters of repairs. I didn't want to have been wrong, so I sent you back instead. She looked at the corridor, at the bluff, at the structure that had kept her children warm for 2 weeks. You were 11 years old. I sent you back because you were right, and I couldn't stand it. Wren looked at this woman who had made one of the smaller decisions in a long series of decisions that had shaped the particular path her life had taken. She thought about what Clem had said about Ezra, that he never got to see his work mean anything to anyone else. She thought about what it would have meant to come here at 11, to have learned from Ezra directly, to have had the years she had lost. Go home, she said, not unkindly. Your children are cold. Mrs. Dunmore went. Harlan Voss did not come himself. His sister came on day 37 after the hollow road had been passable for 3 days, a woman Wren had not met before carrying a bolt of good wool cloth, and an apology that arrived wearing his name, but clearly did not originate in him. Wren accepted the cloth. She did not ask about Voss. She learned what had happened to him through Gideon Rourke. 2 winters later, when the accounting had been done, 18 families in the valley had built corridor systems of their own by 1901. Most of them simpler than hers, but functional, all of them reducing their wood consumption by between 30 and 60%. The market for cut wood in Cinder Hollow had contracted accordingly. Harlan Voss's wood yard was still operating, but at reduced scale its leverage over the valley's families diminished in direct proportion to how many of those families no longer needed to buy as much of what he sold. The mountain's steadiness had undermined his position without anyone needing to confront him about it. She found this not satisfying exactly, but appropriate, the kind of outcome that happened when a system worked as intended. Professor Frick returned in April of 1899, when the mud had consolidated enough to make the road from Lewisburg navigable. He spent 4 days measuring as he had done after the first winter, comparing his readings to the records she had kept through the storm. He sat at her table with the 15th ledger open to the February entries, reading the temperature logs she had maintained through 32 days of a storm that had killed livestock across 4 counties and sent 3 elderly people in Monroe County to their deaths from exposure. When he looked up, his expression had the particular quality of a scientist who has been given data he had not expected to get. The system maintained 41 degrees on the worst night, he said. You have it documented to the hour. The hour, the conditions, the adjustments I made to the vent panels. He looked at the ledger, then at the corridor door, then back at the ledger. Miss Calloway, I want to write a 3rd circular. Not about the principle that's established. About the February event. About what happened here. He set his pencil down on the open page. There are engineers in Morgantown who will not believe these numbers. I want them to not believe these numbers so that they investigate, so that they discover your grandfather's work in a context they cannot dismiss. The 3rd circular went out that fall. It was longer than the first 2 combined. It contained the temperature logs, the structural diagrams of the corridor system, the history of Ezra Calloway's 30 years of observation, the account of 31 people sheltered through the worst winter in living memory, in a structure that burned less wood in a month than most households burned in a week. Frick sent it to the Academy Network, to the State Geological Survey, to 2 engineering journals, to a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania who taught courses in building materials. The University of Pennsylvania colleague wrote back within a month. He wanted to correspond directly with Wren. She wrote him a letter in November of 1899 at the table by the window where she had first read Ezra's journals 13 years earlier. She wrote in the careful, specific language she had developed through 15 ledgers of her own, the language of someone who had learned that precision was not a luxury, but the minimum courtesy you owed to facts. She described the limestone formation, the depth at which temperature stability was achieved, the corridor dimensions, the mortar composition, the vent panel mechanics. She answered the questions he had put to her with the thoroughness of someone who understood that being taken seriously required taking the questions seriously. He wrote back. They corresponded for 3 years. Thomas Holt arrived in the Hollow on a July morning in 1903 when Wren was 33 years old and had long since stopped thinking of herself in terms of what she had been when she arrived here. He came on foot from Cinder Hollow carrying a leather satchel that was not unlike Clem's, which she noticed immediately. He had read all 3 of Frick's circulars and the summary in the engineering journal, and he came with specific questions about the secondary vent panel design. She showed him the corridor. He walked it with the attention of someone reading a text rather than inspecting a building, slowly pausing at each vent location, running his hand along the mortar joints to feel the quality of the seal. He asked about the angle of the baffle panels, the gap tolerance, the weather-stripping material on the doors. He measured the door frame with a folding rule he pulled from the satchel. He made notes. When he had finished asking the questions he had come to ask, he put the notebook away. He stood in the corridor in the cool cave air, moving past him, and looked at the cave mouth at the far end with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone seeing something that shifts their picture of what was possible. "You built all of this." He said it without qualification, without the note of surprise that men sometimes placed under sentences like this one, the note that meant they were surprised because they had expected less. "With Clem Osgood," she said. "He taught me how. I knew why." He looked at her with the direct attention of someone to whom things presented themselves as problems to be understood, rather than impressions to be catalogued. "The why is the harder part," he said. She studied him for a moment, a man who had come 30 miles to ask about vent panel angles, who had used a folding rule on her doorframe, who had understood in 40 minutes of walking the corridor what most people required 3 visits to begin to grasp. A man who had looked at what she had built before he had looked at her. They were married in the spring of 1904. He was a carpenter, a widower, a man of few words, most of which were worth waiting for. He understood why she would not leave this place. More than that, he understood the place itself, its logic, its ongoing conversation with the mountain. He built a proper porch that spring, the porch she had never gotten around to building for herself, with a railing and a bench in an overhang that kept the vestibule entrance dry in rain. He built it out of seasoned white oak he had milled himself, fitted with the precise joinery of someone who considered approximation a personal failure. She told him about Ezra's notes, the 14th ledger, the message to the child who still asked why. He read the ledger one evening at the table by the window, the same lamp in the same position, and when he finished, he set it down carefully and looked at her across the table with an expression that she understood to mean he had grasped something important. "He knew you before you knew yourself," Thomas said. "He knew the kind of person I was," she said. "He recognized the type." She meant it as a small thing. She thought about it for years afterward and concluded it was not small. Clem Osgood died on a Tuesday morning in October of 1908, in the chair on the porch of his own cabin a mile down the hollow, with a bowl of bean soup on the table beside him that had not yet gone entirely cold. He looked, when Wren found him, like a man who had sat down between tasks and decided that he had completed enough of them. His hands were folded in his lap. The lime in the creases of his palms had gone white as chalk. She buried him on the ridge above the bluff where the morning sun reached first and stayed longest. She planted mountain thyme over the turned earth and pressed the handle of his best trowel into the soil at the head of the gray blade, down handle upright, because he had said once in passing, the way he said most things that mattered, that a stonemason's tools ought to stay close. He had left her his cabin, his mule, the kiln. She had a small sum of money she had not known he had, the folding rule he had carried for 40 years, and a letter written in a hand less practiced than Ezra's, but no less considered. "You were the daughter I should have had. Build something." She had already built something. She went on building. The years between Clem's death and the morning she finally sat in the corridor doorway with her hand on the latch were not dramatic in the way the February of 1899 had been dramatic. They were the years of consequence, the slower, longer story that happens after the acute one ends. By 1910, Frick's third circular had been referenced in 2 textbooks. By 1915, the principal, Ezra, had spent 30 years working out in isolation, had a name in academic literature, earth-sheltered thermal buffering. By 1920, the University of Pennsylvania correspondent had retired, but his student had continued the correspondence, asking questions she answered with the same precision she had applied to the first letter. She trained people who came to learn. Young men, young women, some of them sent by Frick's network. Some of them who had simply read about what was in this hollow and traveled to see it. She taught the way Clem had taught her: show it once, watch them try, explain the failure, move on. She did not soften the failures. The work was what it was, and softening it helped no one. Thomas built an addition to the cabin in 1912, 2 more rooms, a proper kitchen, shelves along every wall, because she needed somewhere to put the ledgers she kept adding to. By 1920, there were 23 of them. The original 14, then her 15th, then 8 more. After that, records of temperatures, of repairs, of variations in the cave's behavior during unusual weather events, of the names of families who stored food in the alcove each year, of the systems she had helped other people build. A continuous record of the mountain's conversation with itself, maintained now across 2 generations. Her 2 children, a daughter born in 1906, a son in 1909, grew up in the hollow. The way children grow up in places that have been shaped by a specific purpose. Understanding the purpose before they understood it was unusual. Her daughter thought it was ordinary to check the corridor temperature before breakfast. Her son thought it was ordinary to know the difference between the sound the outer vestibule door made in cold weather versus warm. They were right that these things were ordinary. They were ordinary here in the way that all highly specific knowledge is ordinary to the people who live inside it. Her grandchildren thought she was a character. She found this accurate. In the summer of 1935, her oldest grandchild, her daughter's girl, 10 years old, with the particular seriousness of children who have grown up around adults engaged in real work, came to sit beside her in the corridor doorway while she was making her morning temperature check. "Grandma, does the cave ever change?" Wren had her hand on the latch, feeling the cave air moving through the gap between the door and its frame. The same door Thomas had built in 1904, refitted twice since then, the frame trued by hand each time to maintain the seal. "The cave doesn't change," she said. "That's the whole point of it. But everything outside changes." She looked at her granddaughter, who had the particular seriousness of children who ask questions they actually want answered. "Everything outside changes," she agreed. "That's why we need what doesn't." The girl considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she went back inside, apparently satisfied. Wren stayed in the doorway a while longer, as she often did in the mornings, not because the check required it, but because she had never tired of the particular sensation of the cave's breath moving over her face 53 degrees in July or February, in the good years and the hard ones, indifferent to the surface's drama. She had been making this same check for 49 years that morning. Professor Frick died in 1927. She wrote a letter to his family that took her 4 drafts to complete because she kept trying to be precise about what he had done, and precision kept leading her back to things she had not said to him while he was alive to hear them. She settled finally on this: he had understood that proof required publication, that a thing known only to the person who discovered it might as well be unknown, that Ezra Calloway's work would have remained under a floorboard forever if someone had not been willing to carry it out into the world. She thanked him for carrying it. Thomas died in 1941 of a heart failure that arrived with no particular warning on a March afternoon while he was fitting a new shelf in the alcove. He was found the way Clem had been found, seated, composed, with the characteristic expression of a man who had been between tasks and had simply stopped. She buried him on the ridge near Clem, on the other side of the largest oak where the afternoon light reached. She lived alone after that, which was not a new condition for her, but was a different version of the old one, alone now with the accumulated weight of people who had been here, who had filled the cabin with their particular presence, who had left their marks in the structure. Thomas's shelves, Clem's mortar, the secondary vent panel she had built in the second winter, replaced twice, but still functioning on the same principle. The alcove that now extended 60 feet into the bluff, its walls lined with shelves her son had built, its temperature as steady as ever. The 15th ledger on the table now followed by 23 more. She made the morning temperature check every day until the end. It was the first thing she did after she was dressed, before coffee, before anything. She opened the inner corridor door, set her palm flat against the wall, felt the cave's breath moving past her face, looked at the gauge mounted at eye height, 52 degrees, 53, 54, within the range Ezra had established in 1867, and that had not varied meaningfully in the 78 years since. On a Tuesday morning in April of 1947, she made the check as she always made it, standing in the corridor doorway with her hand on the latch. Her daughter found her there an hour later, still at the doorway, still with her hand on the latch, her face turned toward the cave mouth, as if she had been listening to something. She looked, her daughter would say later, like a woman who had received an answer to a question she had been asking for a very long time. On the wall of the cabin, in the frames, Thomas had built 2 pages hung side by side. The first was from the 14th ledger in Ezra's small, cramped hand, the page she had found by a failing tallow stub on the 3rd night, the page that had addressed itself to the child who still asked why. "What the mountain keeps steady will keep you alive if you learn how to ask it." The second was from Frick's 3rd circular, the academic summary, The technical language, the footnote that read Ezra Calloway, Blackthorn Gap, West Virginia, 1867. Original discovery. The first page was a promise. The second was proof the promise had been kept. Mrs. Dorothea Marsh had called it a box of wind in a house built against a grave. She was right about both. The box was what the corridor became a container for the mountain's breath, a structure built specifically to catch what was already moving, to give direction to what was already happening, to make useful what had always been there waiting to be asked. The grave the house was built against was not Ezra's. It was the grave of the assumption that useful things announce themselves, that value declares its own presence, that the obvious surface of a thing is the complete accounting of what it is. That assumption had been buried at Blackthorn Gap by 30 years of a man writing temperature measurements in small notebooks, and by a girl who read them in a dying light and recognized in them the shape of her own thinking, and by an old stonemason who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to prevent him from helping. The cave still breathes at 53 degrees. It breathed before Ezra Calloway came to Blackthorn Gap with $9 in questions about caves. It breathed through 30 years of his measuring it, through the 2 years his ledgers sat under the floor, after he died, through the winter that nearly killed the girl who found them, through the worst month the valley had known, through 6 decades of a woman maintaining the corridor that made the breathing useful rather than merely constant. She had asked. It had answered. 3 people, 14 ledgers, a corridor 22 feet long, extended and refined across 6 decades. The mountain's breath, which had been waiting considerably longer than any of them, indifferent to the question of whether anyone was there to feel it, and patient, always patient, in the way that only stone can be patient, because stone has had sufficient time to understand that patience is not a posture. It is the most active force there is if you can sustain it long enough.